Welcome to my YouTube channel. I'm Tom West. I hope you will subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I hope that you will share this video with someone else. It could be encouraging, helpful, and build them up and even get them to Jesus. So I hope you'll do that. I call this message the oppression of worship. Worship is the center of the God-centered life. It's important to us. Exodus 20 verse 3 in the Old Testament, "You shall have no other gods before me." The exclusive worship of the God was the Old Covenant or the Old Testament standard. In Matthew 4 verse 10 in the New Testament, "Worship the Lord your God and serve him only." The exclusive worship of the God was the New Covenant or New Testament standard. Worship of God includes a lot more than just going to church. It's living for and serving God every moment of every day. Everything in our life ought to be about worshiping God. But gathering to worship is a part of worship. Always has been, still is, and always will be. In 2020, most states put limits on worship gatherings for people of faith in response to the pandemic. At the same time, it was totally acceptable to protest in the street without any limits. If the pandemic was the issue, why was worship singled out? Government sees worship as non-essential, but in many cases sees protest as essential. For the God-centered person, worship is essential. It's essential part of our walking with the Lord and being a person of faith. Denial of gathering for worship is the oppression of worship. Was 2,600 years ago and is today. There are many ways to oppress worship, and denial of worship gatherings is one of them. You could ask people to use their brain and be sensible and not pass the pandemic on, which they can do. And in some states they did that, and they don't have it any worse off than the states that put oppression on worship. In Daniel chapter 3, we have the historical record of good old King Nebuchadnezzar setting up a huge statue of gold on the plain of Dura in Babylon. This statue was the king's god. It was huge. It was 90 feet high and 9 feet wide. You can think of it as the official state god. Nebuchadnezzar gathered every government official in his government, including Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and his command was to bow down and worship his God when the band broke out with the official worship music of his God. Daniel wasn't present. We don't know where Daniel was. The Bible doesn't tell us what happened to him at this event, but his 3 Hebrew buddies were involved. The law that the king imposed was that anyone who did not fall down and worship his national God would be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace and be burned to death. It was simple. "You will comply with worship of my national God," said Nebuchadnezzar, "or you'll die in the fire." When the music started, all the people fell down and worshiped this huge golden false god of Nebuchadnezzar's. At the time the worship started, the astrologers came forward, and they came forward for one reason, and that was to denounce the Jews. They didn't like these guys who put God first. They told the king that the 3 Jewish men he had appointed as administrators over the province of Babylon did not fall down and worship his God. Well, the astrologers named the 3 men involved who didn't worship the false god. Who were they? They were Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Now, these men had Hebrew names, too, and I mentioned them in an earlier message. Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. But their Babylonian names were used to further implicate them as Babylonian and subject to the false worship imposed on them. It was a trick to implicate them just a little bit harder. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, was furious with rage when he heard that the Jewish guys did not worship his false god. So he had them called in, and he told them that if they would go ahead and fall down and worship the god, everything would be fine. But if not, they would be thrown into the blazing furnace and would be burned to death. He asked them, then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Nebuchadnezzar thought that he could control the worship of these three Jewish guys with threats of punishment. The historical account continues in Daniel 3:16 through 18. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied to the king, O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to save us from it, and he will rescue us from your hand, O king. But even if he does not, we want you to know, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you've set up. These faith-filled Jewish guys knew God would save them, but this is important. They were willing to die in the fire rather than worship a false god. That's the commitment to a God-centered life of worship that God calls us all to. You know, we put ourselves in his hand and worship him only. The unwillingness of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to bow to the oppression of worship made Nebuchadnezzar really, really angry. So he had the furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal. He commanded some of the strongest soldiers in his army to tie up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the furnace. And as the soldiers threw these 3 Hebrew guys into the furnace, it was so hot that it burned the soldiers throwing them into the flames to death. It killed them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were firmly tied up and tossed into the flames. Right away, Nebuchadnezzar said that he saw 4 people in the flames and that they were not tied up and they were walking around in the fire freely. He affirmed that the 4th guy looked like what he called a son of the gods. Now, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego just walked out of the fire. They came out. A crowd of government officials grouped around them and noticed that not a hair was singed, none of their clothing was burned in any way, and they didn't even smell like the smoke that came from the fire. So how does Nebuchadnezzar respond? Well, he praised the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Why? Because he demonstrated his power to save these guys who would not worship any god but him. Nebuchadnezzar recognized that the God with a big G, the only God, honored those who would not bow the knee to anyone but him. He honored those who would only bow the knee to him. The king passed a new law that anyone who said anything against the God of these Hebrew guys would be cut into pieces, and their houses would be turned into piles of rubble, because no other God can save like this. God demonstrated his glory to Nebuchadnezzar, and he saw that. But notice that Nebuchadnezzar did not make worship of the Hebrew God mandatory. He just said that no one could say anything against the God of the Hebrew guys, the God. Now, not all scholars would agree with what I'm going to tell you now, but in my opinion, the appearance of the 4th guy in the fire is what I would call a pre-incarnate appearance of the Messiah before he took on flesh in Jesus of Nazareth. Not necessary for you to agree with that, but it makes a lot of sense to me, and there's a lot of places in the Old Testament where this kind of thing happens. And he took on flesh and came to earth as Jesus of Nazareth, died to pay for our sin, was raised bodily from the dead to give us absolute victory over death forever. So the nature of the Lord is that when his people are in the fire, he's with them. He's with them. We're in a place in America right now when we're in the fire, and we need him. It's important to understand that he's with us in the fire. We just need to invite him in to be with us, make sure that we're close to him, because we're in some tough spots in this country right now. Recently, the House of Representatives passed a piece of legislation called the Equality Act. Now, it has not passed the Senate, probably will not. At least we can hope and pray that it will not. In short, the Equality Act legalizes discrimination against people of faith. If you don't support a person's stated sexual orientation, You would have broken that law, and you could be held liable for that. If you don't support a person's stated sexual identity, people identify as all kinds of things these days, you would have broken the law. Under this law, your daughter would have to be in the same locker room and shower with a young man who identified as a woman. And if you protested, you'd be breaking the law. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. If you support the traditional understanding of marriage being between a man and a woman, you would have broken the law. You remember, I pastored churches for 30 years, and every now and then I'll still do a wedding after 45 years. The thought of performing a marriage for someone other than a couple that is comprised of a man and a woman is outside my moral compass and violates my worship. I wouldn't do such a wedding under any circumstance. So I would be breaking the law. Should the Equality Act become law, it would not take long for me to be out of legal compliance. It would become the oppression of worship for me. The Lord would be with me in the fire, and I would certainly invite him in. I do that every day anyway. Does that mean that I would be delivered from all legal trouble? No, not necessarily. Just like the 3 Hebrew guys made it clear that they recognized that they might die in the fire, and they would if they needed to. In John chapter 6, Jesus' disciples went down to the lake of Capernaum, they call it in that place. It's the Sea of Galilee. They jumped in a boat to cross the lake. Now, Jesus wasn't with them. So a storm kicked up, and they rowed about 3.5 miles across the lake. Jesus approached the boat on the water, and the disciples were scared. They were fearful. And finally, Jesus said to them, "It is I, don't be afraid." That's in John 6:20. Then they let him into the boat, and they arrived at the shore where they were headed. When we're in a storm or when we're in the fire, it's important to invite Jesus in to be with us. Regardless of the eventual outcome, the solution is always for the Lord to be with us, like he was with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Invite the Lord to be with you in your challenges. Invite the Lord to be with you in your firestorms. Back in February of 2015, we saw in the news the video of 21 Coptic Christian men who were in orange jumpsuits at a beach. They'd been taken captive in Libya by ISIS, the terrorist group. Each man was accompanied by a terrorist dressed in black. Each terrorist, and this is hard, but he cut one of the Coptic Christians' heads off, each one of them. All 21 of them were decapitated that day. They were under the oppression of worship. Do you suppose the Lord was with them in the fire? Yes, he was with them. That's how it works with him. That's how it works. He walked them into his heaven as he was with them in their firestorm, in their time of need. I believe the Lord was in the fire with those men that day, and I believe that they claimed Romans 8:37, which we need to claim in present-day America. Knowing all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. When the Lord is with you in the midst of the fire, it does not mean you'll always escape the fire, but it does mean that he always sees you through the fire. With him present with us, we conquer. We get through it somehow. Would you pray with me? Father, give us the wisdom to invite you into our life, to be present with us in whatever difficulty we encounter. And then help us to commit to you, to worship you only, to do life in a God-centered way with you. And I know you'll empower us and pull us through the challenges we might encounter. So we ask that, and we ask you to be involved in our life. In Jesus' name, amen. Again, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel so you can get some more messages. And I hope that you will share this little message with other people so they can be encouraged and hopefully lifted up by it. I will see you at least next Saturday.